Some of the strangest places in history are not hidden because they were meant to be secret. They were simply forgotten. Ancient tombs buried beneath enormous mounds. Lost villages abandoned for centuries. Fortresses swallowed by the landscape. Temples left unfinished. And ancient structures that still leave us wondering what happened to the people who built them. Tonight, we're traveling across different parts of the world to explore these forgotten places and the stories still buried within them. Hey, before we start, a bunch of you asked about the sleep book I mentioned, so I dropped it to $9.99 for now. Link's in the description if you want to grab it. Okay, let's go. Make sure to subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. And before we begin, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, let's begin our journey. The mummy portraits of Hawara. In the dry landscape of Egypt, archaeologists discovered something unexpectedly human. Portraits. Not paintings of gods or pharaohs, but realistic faces of ordinary people who lived nearly 2,000 years ago. Their eyes, their hairstyles, their jewelry, and even the expressions on their faces were preserved on thin wooden panels. These are the famous Fayum mummy portraits, and many of the most important examples were discovered at Hawara. Hawara lies in the Fayum region of Egypt, an area that became an important center during the Roman period. The portraits date mainly from the 1st to 3rd centuries AD, when Egypt was part of the Roman Empire. The people shown in these paintings lived in a world where Egyptian burial traditions existed alongside Greek and Roman culture. Their portraits reflect that unusual mixture. Unlike traditional Egyptian funerary images, these portraits look remarkably lifelike. The artists carefully painted individual features, curly hair, jewelry, clothing, and realistic skin tones. Some portraits show men, others women, and some depict children. For the first time, we are looking directly at the faces of people who lived in Roman Egypt. The paintings were usually created on wooden panels, using techniques such as encaustic, where pigments were mixed with wax. Some were also painted using tempera. The encaustic technique allowed artists to build up layers of color, creating subtle shadows and highlights across the face. The results could be remarkably detailed. But these were not ordinary family portraits. They were attached to mummies, usually positioned over the face of the deceased. The painting, therefore, became part of the person's burial equipment. The living family could preserve an image of the person, while the mummy remained prepared for the afterlife. This combination of realistic Roman-style portraiture with ancient Egyptian funerary traditions is what makes the portraits so unusual. The faces look like paintings from the classical Mediterranean world, but they were created specifically for Egyptian burial practices. Some of the portraits are incredibly detailed. One young woman from Hawara, for example, has carefully painted curls across her forehead, dark eyes, and small earrings. Her face appears calm, almost as if she is looking directly at the viewer. Yet she lived nearly 2,000 years ago. Another portrait shows a man with short hair, a beard, and a serious expression. His clothing includes a tunic with a purple stripe, reflecting Roman fashions of the period. The painting was created around the early 2nd century AD. The man's name is unknown, but his face survived. That is one of the most fascinating things about the Fayum portraits. For most ancient people, we know almost nothing about their appearance. We may know their names, their occupations, or where they lived, but rarely do we have a realistic image of their face. The Hawara portraits are different. They preserve actual individuals, even when their identities have been lost. The portraits also reveal changing fashions, hairstyles, jewelry, clothing, and even facial presentation changed over the generations. Researchers can compare these details with known Roman fashions, helping establish when particular portraits were created. The paintings therefore act as both art and historical evidence. But there is still much we do not know. Were the portraits painted while the people were alive, or shortly after death? Did artists work from memory? Did they use earlier paintings? Or were some created specifically for burial? Different evidence suggests that the process may not have been identical in every case. The discovery of the portraits transformed the study of ancient painting. Large amounts of ancient Greek and Roman panel painting have disappeared because wood and pigments normally decay. The dry Egyptian climate helped preserve these fragile works. As a result, the Fayum portraits are among the most important surviving examples of ancient panel painting. Eventually, the tradition disappeared. Roman Egypt changed, funerary customs evolved, and the practice of attaching realistic painted portraits to mummies gradually ended. The portraits were left inside tombs, where they remained for centuries. Then, archaeologists began uncovering them. At Hawara, large numbers of mummy portraits were excavated during archaeological work in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The faces that had been hidden for generations suddenly appeared again. Today, many are preserved in museums around the world, but they still feel strangely personal. A painted face, a pair of eyes, a hairstyle, a piece of jewelry, small details that make an ancient person seem almost present. The tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae. On a quiet plain in southern Iran, a small stone monument stands almost alone. It is not enormous. It has no towering columns, and there are no elaborate sculptures covering its walls. Yet this simple structure was built for one of the most powerful rulers of the ancient world. This is the tomb of Cyrus the Great, located within the ancient city of Pasargadae. Pasargadae was founded in the 6th century BC by Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. It became the first dynastic capital of the Achaemenid Empire, a vast kingdom that eventually stretched across much of Western Asia. The tomb was built within this royal landscape, surrounded by palaces, gardens, and monumental structures. The tomb itself is surprisingly simple. A tall stone platform supports a small chamber, above which sits a steeply pitched roof. The entire structure is made from carefully cut limestone blocks. There are no enormous inscriptions covering the walls, no giant statues, and very little decoration. Its power comes from its proportions. The design is also unusual for an ancient Persian royal monument. The lower section resembles a stepped platform, while the upper chamber looks almost like a small house. The combination creates a structure that is both monumental and remarkably restrained. According to UNESCO, the mausoleum is one of the most important surviving elements of Pasargadae, the first major expression of royal Achaemenid architecture. The site itself covers around 160 hectares, including palaces, gardens, a fortified terrace, and the tomb. For centuries, the tomb remained standing while the city around it disappeared. The royal palaces collapsed, the gardens vanished, and the Achaemenid Empire became part of ancient history. But the tomb survived. Its survival is especially remarkable because the structure was exposed to the harsh environment of the Morghab Plain. Strong winds, intense sunlight, and occasional flooding have affected parts of the archaeological site over the centuries. Yet the tomb remains largely intact. The monument also attracted visitors long after the Achaemenid period. Ancient writers recorded traditions about Cyrus's tomb, and centuries later, the monument continued to be associated with the legendary Persian king. Its identity became one of the enduring traditions connected with Pasargadae. Alexander the Great is also traditionally associated with the tomb. After conquering the Persian Empire, he is said to have visited the monument. Ancient accounts describe the tomb as containing a chamber, a golden sarcophagus, and an inscription identifying Cyrus. But the original contents did not survive. Over time, the tomb became surrounded by different stories. Some later traditions gave the monument other identities, and its original purpose was not always understood. But archaeological evidence and the location within Pasargadae strongly connect the structure with Cyrus the Great. What makes the monument especially interesting is how different it feels from later Persian royal architecture. At Persepolis, the Achaemenid kings created enormous ceremonial buildings, massive stairways, columns, and elaborate reliefs. At Pasargadae, the architecture feels more open, more restrained, and closely connected with the surrounding landscape. The royal gardens were another important part of the city. Pasargadae introduced the famous four gardens arrangement, a design divided by waterways or pathways into four sections. This became an important influence on later Persian garden architecture. The tomb therefore stood within a carefully planned royal landscape, rather than in isolation. But the person buried here was not an ordinary ruler. Cyrus had created an empire that brought together many different peoples, languages, religions, and traditions. Pasargadae itself reflected this diversity, with architectural influences drawn from different cultures across the empire. The city eventually lost its position as the main royal center. Darius the Great later developed Persepolis, and Pasargadae became less important politically. Its palaces were abandoned, its gardens disappeared, but the tomb remained. Today, The surrounding landscape is remarkably open. The ancient palace ruins are scattered across the plain, while the tomb stands as one of the most recognizable structures at the site. Its simplicity makes it easy to overlook, until you understand who it was built for. More than 2,000 years have passed since Cyrus ruled the Persian Empire. His empire disappeared, the royal court disappeared, and the people who once walked through Pasargadae are long gone. But the limestone blocks of his tomb remain in place. The tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae is remarkable because it does not need enormous scale to make an impression. A simple stone platform, a small chamber, and a carefully designed roof were enough to preserve the memory of one of antiquity's most influential rulers. The palace around it disappeared, the empire disappeared, and the original treasures were lost. But the tomb survived. Standing alone on the ancient plain of Fars, it remains a quiet reminder of Cyrus the Great and of the first great royal architecture of the Persian Empire, the Great Arch of Ctesiphon. Beside the Tigris River in Iraq, a gigantic brick arch rises from the ruins of an ancient city. There are no marble columns, no carved statues, just an enormous vaulted structure that has survived for centuries. This is Tak Kasra, also known as the Arch of Ctesiphon, the most famous surviving monument of the ancient Sasanian capital. Ctesiphon was one of the great cities of the ancient Near East, and for centuries, it served as an important capital of the Persian world. The city stood along the Tigris, in a region where empires repeatedly fought for control. The Sasanians made Ctesiphon one of the most important centers of their empire. Tak Kasra formed part of a huge royal palace complex. Its enormous vaulted hall, known as an awan, was designed to create an extraordinary interior space. The surviving arch rises roughly 37 meters, making its scale difficult to appreciate until you stand beneath it. The structure was built almost entirely from brick. No enormous stone blocks were needed. Instead, the builders created a massive curved vault from brickwork. The result was one of the most impressive examples of large-scale vaulted construction in the ancient world. The exact date of construction remains debated. The monument is generally placed somewhere between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD, during the Sasanian period. Some traditions associate its construction with early Sasanian rulers, while others connect the surviving palace with the reign of Khosrow I. The precise history remains uncertain, but the purpose is easier to understand. This was not an ordinary building. The Great Iwan formed part of a royal palace, a place associated with the power of the Sasanian kings. Visitors entering the enormous hall would have been surrounded by architecture designed to emphasize the authority of the empire. Imagine approaching Ctesiphon nearly 1,500 years ago. The city would have looked completely different. Buildings, palaces, markets, gardens, and busy streets would have surrounded the enormous royal complex. And above it all, the great brick vault would have dominated the skyline. The scale of the hall was not accidental. The Sasanians used architecture to communicate power. A ruler did not need to stand in front of every visitor. The building itself could make the statement. The enormous vaulted space created an impression of wealth, engineering ability, and imperial authority. But the city eventually faced a major transformation. In the 7th century, Arab Muslim armies conquered Ctesiphon in 637 AD. The Sasanian Empire soon collapsed, and the political center of the region moved elsewhere. Ctesiphon did not immediately disappear. People continued living in the wider area, and the ancient city remained significant for some time. But its royal palace no longer served the same purpose. Parts of the complex were dismantled, and bricks were reused in later construction. The great palace slowly became a ruin. The Tak Kasra survived, but not untouched. Centuries of weathering, human activity, and neglect damaged the structure. Yet the enormous vault remained standing, even after much of the city around it had vanished. The location eventually became associated with Salman Pak, a modern town near the ruins of Ctesiphon. The name refers to Salman al-Farsi, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, whose tomb became an important pilgrimage site in the area. Today, very little of the ancient imperial city remains above ground. That makes Tak Kasra even more striking. One enormous structure survives, standing above the surrounding landscape, a final fragment of a city that once represented Persian imperial power. The monument has also faced serious preservation challenges. Parts of the structure have deteriorated, and restoration efforts have taken place at different times. The survival of the Great Vault is therefore not guaranteed forever. Every remaining brick represents another piece of Ctesiphon's history. Tak Kasra is remarkable because the city that created it has almost disappeared. The palaces are gone. The royal court is gone. The Sasanian Empire is gone. But the great brick vault remains. For centuries, it has survived conquest, abandonment, reuse, and the slow effects of time. Today, standing beside the ruins of Ctesiphon, the enormous arch still rises above the landscape, a final reminder of a Persian capital that once stood among the greatest cities of the ancient world. The ancient city of Kish. On the plains of southern Iraq, a vast archaeological mound marks the remains of a city that was already ancient before many of the civilizations we know today had even appeared. This is Kish, one of the most important cities of ancient Sumer. Today, the site is known as Tel al-Haimir, located roughly 80 kilometers south of Baghdad and about 12 kilometers east of ancient Babylon. Kish was occupied for an extraordinarily long period. Archaeological evidence stretches from the Ubaid period, through the early dynastic age, and eventually into the Hellenistic period. Generation after generation, buildings were constructed, destroyed, covered, and rebuilt. The result is a landscape formed from thousands of years of human activity. Kish was especially important during the earliest periods of Sumerian history. Its name appears repeatedly in ancient Mesopotamian traditions, and the city became closely connected with ideas of kingship. In later Sumerian tradition, Kish was associated with the beginning of kingship after the mythical flood. The phrase King of Kish eventually became a powerful political title, used by rulers who wanted to associate themselves with the prestige of the ancient city. The ruins today are divided across several large mounds. Among them is Tel al-Haimir, where the remains of a major ziggurat still rise above the surrounding plain. The structure was dedicated to the gods Zababa and Ishtar, and its later reconstruction is associated with the Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. The ziggurat would once have looked very different. Today, only portions of the ancient structure survive, but originally, the stepped monument would have risen above the surrounding city, making it visible from a considerable distance. For people approaching Kish, the temple complex would have been one of the defining features of the city. Kish was not simply a religious center. It was a major urban settlement, with temples, administrative buildings, residential areas, workshops, and systems for managing the resources of the surrounding countryside. Like other Sumerian cities, its power depended heavily on agriculture, trade, and organized administration. The city's location also mattered. Kish stood within the flat alluvial landscape of Mesopotamia, a region created by the Tigris and Euphrates river systems. The land was fertile, but it required careful management. Canals carried water toward agricultural fields, allowing large communities to survive in an environment that otherwise had very little rainfall. Kish was also connected to long-distance trade. Objects discovered at the site include materials that came from far beyond southern Mesopotamia. One particularly interesting discovery is a seal from the Indus Valley civilization, evidence of the connections that existed between Mesopotamia and South Asia during the Bronze Age. Perhaps the most fascinating object connected with Kish is the Kish tablet. This small limestone tablet contains pictographic signs, dating to the late Uruk period, around the time when writing was beginning to develop in Mesopotamia. The signs are still not completely understood, and scholars continue to debate their relationship to the earliest forms of cuneiform writing. This makes Kish particularly important. The city does not simply preserve the remains of an ancient civilization. It also sits within the story of how writing itself developed. Before long texts recorded kings, wars, laws, and myths, early Mesopotamian scribes were already experimenting with signs to record information. Kish preserves part of that transition. But the city continued long after the earliest writing systems appeared. Different rulers controlled Kish, different temples were built, and the religious importance of the city changed over time. Its patron gods also changed depending on the period. By the Old Babylonian period, Zababa and the goddess Bau, along with Ishtar, had become particularly important at Kish. The city's long history also means that archaeology at Kish is complicated. Excavations were carried out at different times, beginning in the 19th century, with major campaigns taking place during the early 20th century. Archaeologists uncovered temples, palaces, houses, burials, objects, and enormous quantities of pottery and other material. But the site is so large, that much of Kish still remains unexplored. The ruins have also faced serious challenges. Some areas have been damaged. Objects have been removed from their original archaeological context, and parts of the site have been affected by illegal excavation. This makes careful archaeological research increasingly important. Once an artifact is removed without recording where it came from, a large part of its historical meaning can be lost. And that is what makes an ancient city like Kish so different from a single monument. A ziggurat can show us how people built. A temple can reveal something about religion. But an entire city can reveal how thousands of people lived together. Kish contains fragments of all of these stories. Imagine the city at its height, mud brick buildings stretching across the plain, canals carrying water through the countryside, merchants arriving with goods, priests entering temples, and scribes recording information on clay tablets. Above the city, the great temple platforms would have dominated the skyline. Then, the centuries passed. Kish declined. Other cities became more powerful, and political centers shifted throughout Mesopotamia. The buildings collapsed, mud brick walls returned to the earth, and the city slowly became a series of enormous mounds. Today, the landscape is much quieter. The great city is gone, but the mounds remain. The ziggurat at Tel al-Hamir still marks the ancient settlement, while beneath the soil, thousands of years of occupation remain layered one above another. The wooden structure of Colombo Falls. Beside the Colombo River in Zambia, archaeologists discovered something that should almost never survive this long. Wood. Not a small fragment, but two large pieces of timber that had been deliberately shaped and joined together. And the astonishing part, they are at least 476,000 years old. This is the wooden structure of Colombo Falls, the oldest known evidence of structural use of wood. Colombo Falls lies in northern Zambia, near the border with Tanzania. The area contains a remarkable archaeological record, with evidence of ancient human activity stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. But the discovery of the wooden structure revealed something archaeologists had rarely been able to see before: how ancient people worked with wood. Wood normally disappears from the archaeological record. It rots, breaks apart, and eventually returns to the soil. Stone can survive for millions of years. Wood usually cannot. But at Colombo Falls, the conditions were different. The timber had been buried in waterlogged sediments, where the lack of oxygen slowed the natural processes that normally destroy wood, and that allowed something extraordinary to survive. The two main pieces were not simply lying beside one another. One log had been deliberately cut with a notch, and another piece had been fitted across it. The two pieces locked together, creating a connection between separate sections of timber. The marks on the wood show that this was not a natural break. Someone had deliberately shaped it. The exact purpose of the structure remains uncertain. Researchers have suggested that it could have been part of a platform, a walkway, or another type of construction. We cannot say exactly what it looked like when it was complete, but the way the timber was joined tells us something important. The builders were planning how separate pieces could work together. That is what makes Colombo Falls so remarkable. These ancient people were not simply picking up branches. They were selecting large pieces of wood, shaping them, cutting them, and combining them into a larger structure. The work required tools, planning, and an understanding of how wood behaved. The age of the discovery makes it even more extraordinary. The sediments surrounding the structure were dated to around 476,000 years ago. That places the construction hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans appeared. Whoever built it was an ancient hominin, not Homo sapiens. Other worked pieces of wood were also discovered at Colombo Falls. They included a wedge, a digging stick, a cut piece of timber, and a notched branch. These objects came from different layers, dating to roughly 390,000 and 324,000 years ago. So the evidence does not appear to represent a single moment. Woodworking was happening here repeatedly. For decades, stone tools have dominated our understanding of early technology. That is partly because stone survives. Wood does not. This creates a strange problem for archaeologists. The ancient people may have used wood constantly, but almost all evidence of it has disappeared. Colombo gives us a rare glimpse into that missing world. Imagine this landscape nearly 500,000 years ago. The Colombo River flowing through the valley, trees growing along its banks, and ancient hominins moving through the forest. They could have used stone tools to cut and shape timber, turning trees into objects that were useful to them. Some of those objects may have been temporary. Others may have formed part of larger structures. Then the river changed. Sediment covered the wooden remains, and the waterlogged ground protected them. Years became centuries. Centuries became thousands of years. And eventually, hundreds of thousands of years passed. The people who built the structure disappeared completely, but the wood remained buried. The discovery also raises a much larger question. If ancient hominins were capable of building with timber nearly 500,000 years ago, what else were they constructing? There may have been shelters, platforms, walkways, storage areas, or other wooden structures that simply left no trace. The archaeological record may therefore be showing us only a tiny part of their technological world. And that is perhaps the most interesting part of Colombo Falls. The discovery is not important simply because the wood is old. It is important because it shows that ancient hominins were transforming their environment. They were selecting materials, changing their shape, joining separate pieces, and creating something that did not exist naturally. This gives us a different picture of the distant past. Early humans and their relatives were not limited to simple stone tools. They worked with materials that were abundant around them, especially wood. But because those materials rarely survive, their abilities have been almost invisible to us. Today, the Colombo River still flows through the landscape. The forest still surrounds the region, and the archaeological site remains beneath the ground. But deep within those ancient sediments, a few pieces of wood survived long enough to tell us something extraordinary. The wooden structure of Colombo Falls is more than a prehistoric construction. It is evidence of planning, woodworking, and technological ability almost 500,000 years ago. We do not know exactly what the structure was used for, or which ancient hominin built it, but we know that someone deliberately shaped those logs, cut them, and fitted them together. And because almost every other wooden structure from that distant world has disappeared, these few surviving pieces may be one of the rarest glimpses we have into how our ancient relatives actually built their world. The Aslantash Phrygian Monument. In the rocky valleys of central Turkey, an ancient tomb was carved directly into the face of a massive stone. At its entrance, two powerful lions rise from the rock. They face each other, with smaller lion cubs beneath them. Above the doorway, a strange winged symbol stretches across the stone, and behind the decorated facade, a burial chamber disappears into the mountain. This is Aslantash, one of the remarkable monuments left behind by the ancient Phrygians. Aslantash stands in the Gynush Valley, a landscape filled with cliffs, rock-cut tombs, sacred monuments, and ancient carvings. The monument is generally dated to the 7th century BC, a period when the Phrygians were an important power in central Anatolia. Instead of building every monument from separate blocks, the Phrygians often carved directly into the natural rock. At Aslantash, the mountain itself became the tomb. The name Aslantash means lie on stone. The reason can be seen immediately. Two large lions dominate the entrance, standing upright on their hind legs, their bodies turned toward one another. Beneath them, smaller lions appear near their feet. The animals create the impression of guardians protecting the doorway. The entrance leads into a small chamber, cut directly into the rock. The room has a gently vaulted ceiling and a smaller compartment on one side. Inside that compartment, there is a stone platform known as a cline. The simple interior is very different from the elaborate facade outside. Whoever was buried here was probably someone of considerable importance. The monument is generally regarded as an elite Phrygian tomb, possibly belonging to an important ruler or noble. But the person's identity has been lost. There is no surviving inscription telling us their name. Only the monument remains, above the entrance. The carvings become even more unusual. A form resembling a tree of life rises across the stone, while a winged solar symbol appears above it. These symbols were carefully carved into the facade, along with the powerful lions. The entire front was designed to be seen from the valley. The surrounding landscape makes the monument even more interesting. Aslantash is not isolated. Another rock-cut tomb called Ulantash stands nearby. while the Maltash Monument lies farther along the same valley. Other rock monuments, altars, and carved spaces are scattered across the region. The valley appears to have been an important part of the Phrygian sacred landscape. The Phrygians had a strong religious tradition centered around a powerful mother goddess, known in their own inscriptions as Matar. Many of their monumental rock facades were connected with this religious world. The mountains and cliffs were not simply natural scenery. They became part of the places where people worshipped, remembered their dead, and marked important individuals. But the exact meaning of the symbols at Aslantash is difficult to reconstruct. The lions clearly dominate the entrance, yet we cannot be certain what they represented to the people who carved them. The winged symbol may have carried religious meaning, but its original interpretation is not completely known. The stone survived. The explanation did not. Imagine seeing Aslantash when the carvings were newly completed. The rock would have been sharply cut. The lions would have stood out clearly against the surface, and the symbols above the entrance would have been much easier to recognize. A procession could have approached the tomb, passed between the stone lions, and entered the dark chamber beyond. Then, the centuries passed. The Phrygian kingdom disappeared. Other civilizations took control of Anatolia. Religious traditions changed, and the people who created the tomb became part of the distant past. But Aslantash remained where it had always been. The rock slowly weathered. Some of the details became less distinct, and parts of the monument suffered damage over time. Yet the main features survived. The lions are still recognizable. The entrance remains visible, and the burial chamber is still carved into the rock. Today, the Goynush Valley is quiet. There are no ancient ceremonies, no royal processions, and no one knows exactly what happened inside the tomb thousands of years ago. But the monument still communicates something clearly. Someone important was buried here, and their memory was meant to last. The Aslantash Phrygian monument is a remarkable example of a civilization turning natural rock into architecture. The Phrygians carved a tomb into the mountain, placed powerful lions around its entrance, and covered the facade with symbols whose full meanings have now been partly forgotten. We may never know who was buried inside, or exactly what the ancient carvings meant. But the two stone lions are still there, standing beside the doorway, guarding a silent chamber carved into the rock more than 2,000 years ago. The bakery of Silvanus at Ostia Antica. In the ruins of ancient Ostia, archaeologists uncovered something surprisingly ordinary: a bakery. Not just an oven, but an entire Roman workshop where grain was ground, dough was prepared, and bread was baked for the people of the city. Hidden among the ruins, the building also contained a small shrine dedicated to the god Silvanus. This was the Molino del Silvano, one of the best preserved bakeries of ancient Ostia. Ostia was Rome's great port city, located at the mouth of the Tiber River. For centuries, ships arrived here carrying grain and other goods from across the Roman world. That grain had to be stored, processed, and eventually turned into food. The bakery of Silvanus was part of that enormous system. The building was constructed around the beginning of the 2nd century AD, but its bakery operations developed later. Inside, archaeologists found large stone millstones, basalt floors, kneading equipment, stone basins, and a large oven. This was not a small household kitchen. It was an industrial workplace. The millstones were especially important. Roman bakeries often combined milling and baking in the same building. Grain was poured into the upper part of the mill, and animals such as horses or mules could turn the mechanism. As the stone rotated, the grain was crushed into flour. The process could continue for hours, producing the quantities needed to supply a growing city. After the grain was ground, the flour had to be mixed with water, kneaded, and prepared for baking. Large basins and specialized equipment were found inside the building, showing how many different stages of bread production took place under the same roof. The workers were not simply cooking for themselves. They were producing food for customers. The bakery also had several shops facing the street. People could approach the building, buy bread, and continue through the busy streets of Ostia. Behind those public spaces, the production areas were much more demanding. Grinding grain created constant noise. Flour filled the air, and the ovens produced intense heat. The bakery was also connected with one of Ostia's largest grain warehouses. The enormous Grandi Horea stood directly across the street. This arrangement made practical sense. Grain could be stored nearby, then moved into the bakery, where it could be processed into flour and bread. The entire operation was part of a much larger food supply system. But the most unusual discovery was hidden farther inside. A narrow room contained paintings and traces of a small shrine, dedicated to Silvanus, a Roman god associated with forests, fields, and the countryside. The shrine was located within the bakery itself. Why would a busy bakery contain a sacred space? We cannot know exactly. The workers may have had a particular connection with Silvanus, or the shrine may have belonged to people living or working in the building. Whatever its original purpose, it created a strange combination. A place where flour was ground, bread was baked, and a god was worshipped. The building also preserved traces of the people who worked there. Tools, metal fittings, fragments of equipment, and objects connected with the operation of the mills were found among the ruins. Some evidence even points to craftsmen who maintained the complicated machinery. A Roman bakery required more than bakers. It needed people who could repair the equipment, maintain the wooden structures, and keep the entire operation running. Then, something went terribly wrong. Near the end of the 3rd century AD, the building was destroyed by a major fire. The flames damaged the structure. Upper floors collapsed, and the rooms were filled with debris. But that disaster had an unexpected consequence. The destruction sealed many objects where they had been left. For archaeologists, the burned remains became a time capsule. Objects that might otherwise have disappeared were trapped beneath the collapsed building. The destruction layer preserved evidence of how the bakery had functioned and what people had been doing there. Eventually, the bakery was abandoned. The ovens stopped burning. The millstones stopped turning, and the people who had worked there disappeared. Ostia itself slowly declined. As Rome's economic world changed, the busy port became quieter, and eventually, the ancient city was largely abandoned. Centuries passed, buildings collapsed, vegetation spread, and the bakery disappeared beneath layers of earth and rubble. But the stone millstones remained, the oven remained, and the small shrine survived inside the ruined building. Today, walking through the remains of Ostia Antica, it is possible to see the spaces where Roman workers once spent their days. The enormous millstones still sit inside the bakery. The oven remains, and the arrangement of the rooms gives an impression of how the business operated. It is a remarkably ordinary place, and that is exactly what makes it interesting. The bakery of Silvanus gives us a glimpse into everyday Roman life that monuments and palaces cannot provide. This was a place where people worked. Grain was ground, dough was kneaded, bread was baked, and customers came through the doors. Yet inside the same building, a small shrine honored an ancient god. Nearly 2,000 years later, the workers are gone. The bread has disappeared, and the voices of the bakery have fallen silent. But the millstones and oven remain, quiet reminders of an ordinary Roman workplace, where something as simple as a loaf of bread connected an entire city to the vast machinery of the Roman world. The Ta Arat megalithic temple. In the quiet village of Mar in Malta, a small group of enormous stones hides a remarkable prehistoric story. At first, the site looked like little more than a mound of rocks beneath a large carob tree. But when archaeologists began clearing the ground, they uncovered something much older. 2 megalithic temples, built thousands of years ago. This is Ta Arat, one of Malta's remarkable prehistoric temple sites. The larger temple was built during the Gentija phase, around the 4th millennium BC. That means these stones were being arranged long before the great monuments of many later civilizations. The builders had no iron tools, no modern machinery, and no written instructions. Yet they created a carefully planned monumental complex. The larger temple has a distinctive curved facade, with a large entrance opening toward the front. Beyond the entrance, a central rectangular space leads deeper into the structure. Several rounded rooms extend from this central area, creating the characteristic layout seen in Malta's megalithic temples. The walls were built from enormous blocks of local limestone. Some stones are much larger than a person, and their surfaces were carefully positioned to create strong, stable walls. The builders used what was available around them, transforming the local limestone into monumental architecture. But Ta Arat is unusual because there are actually 2 temples here. The second structure is considerably smaller, and it follows a similar basic design. At some point, part of the older temple was modified, making room for the smaller building. This means the site was not created all at once. It changed over time. That detail is important. The people who built Taurat did not simply construct the temples, use them, and leave. Later generations returned, modified parts of the complex, and continued using the same place. The site therefore preserves several stages of prehistoric activity. Before the temples were excavated, the ruins were almost completely hidden. The area appeared as a simple mound in an agricultural field, covered partly by a large carob tree. From the surface, there was little indication of the monumental structure underneath. Excavations began in the early 20th century. Archaeologists returned to the site several times, including major excavations during the 1920s, and later work in the middle of the century. As the soil was removed, the outlines of the temples gradually emerged. The excavations also revealed something unexpected. Objects from periods both before and after the construction of the temples were found at the site. That suggests Taurat had a longer history than the surviving stone buildings alone might suggest. The location was important before the monumental structures appeared, and it continued to be used afterward. One of the most fascinating discoveries was a tiny limestone model of a building. It resembles a miniature prehistoric structure, complete with architectural details. Why was it made? We cannot know for certain. It may have had a symbolic or ritual purpose, but its exact meaning remains unknown. That uncertainty surrounds much of Taurat. We know the buildings were carefully designed. We know people invested enormous effort into constructing them, and we know the site was used over generations. But we do not have written records explaining what happened inside. The temples are often described as religious monuments, and their layout strongly suggests ceremonial use. But we should be careful about imagining them as simple versions of modern places of worship. The people who built them lived in a very different world. Their beliefs, their rituals, and their understanding of the landscape are largely lost. The architecture itself gives us some clues. The temples are approached through open spaces, then move inward through increasingly enclosed areas. Large stone walls create a sense of separation from the surrounding landscape. The movement from outside into the temple may have been an important part of whatever ceremonies took place here. The builders also solved a difficult architectural problem. The interior spaces needed roofs, yet the walls were made from enormous stone slabs. The surviving masonry suggests that the roofs were constructed using corbelled techniques, with stones gradually projecting inward until the space could be covered. For prehistoric builders, this was a sophisticated solution. The temples were eventually abandoned. The reasons are still not completely understood. The prehistoric communities that created Malta's megalithic monuments disappeared, and their distinctive temple-building tradition came to an end. The buildings remained behind, but the society that created them did not. For thousands of years, the structures slowly became buried. Stone walls collapsed, soil accumulated, and vegetation spread across the remains. Eventually, the temples became difficult to recognize from the surface. Only the large stones hinted at what was underneath. Today, Taurat is part of Malta's group of megalithic temples recognized for their exceptional prehistoric architecture. The site is smaller than some of Malta's better-known monuments, but that is part of what makes it interesting. It provides a quieter look at the people who created this extraordinary tradition. Standing among the stones, it is difficult to imagine this place as an empty field. Thousands of years ago, people were gathering here, moving through the monumental entrance, working with enormous blocks of limestone, and maintaining a place that had already become important to earlier generations. Taurat is a reminder that Malta's prehistoric temples were not isolated buildings. They were part of a long tradition, built, modified, used, and eventually abandoned by generations of people. Today, the ceremonies are forgotten. The builders have no names, and the meaning of the tiny stone model remains uncertain. But the great limestone walls still stand, preserving the outline of a prehistoric world, built thousands of years ago on a small Mediterranean island, the Pentre Ifan Dolmen. On a quiet hillside in western Wales, a massive stone appears to balance almost impossibly above the ground. 3 upright stones support it, while while the huge capstone stretches across the top like a roof. It looks simple, almost too simple, but this monument was built more than 5,000 years ago by people who had no metal tools and no machinery. This is Pentre Ifan, one of the most remarkable Neolithic monuments in Wales. Pentre Ifan stands in Pembrokeshire, with the Preseli Hills rising behind it. The surrounding landscape is important, because the same hills contain the famous bluestone outcrops later associated with Stonehenge. The monument itself was built using local stone, including material from the Preseli region. The enormous capstone is the feature that immediately catches the eye. It is around 5 meters long and weighs several tons, yet it rests high above the ground, supported by 3 upright stones. From a distance, it almost looks as though the builders simply placed a giant slab on top of 3 pillars, but creating that arrangement would have required careful planning. Pentre Ifan belongs to the Neolithic period, when communities across Britain were beginning to farm, build permanent settlements, and create monuments for their dead. These communities had no written language to explain their work. Instead, their beliefs survived through stone. The monument is generally understood as a chambered tomb. The stones we see today are only part of the original structure. The burial chamber would originally have been associated with a much larger earthen mound. Over thousands of years, much of that covering disappeared, leaving the massive stone framework exposed. This changes the way the monument would have looked in the Neolithic period. It may once have appeared less like a stone table, and more like a large artificial mound covering a hidden chamber. People approaching it would have seen an earth-covered monument rising from the landscape, with the stone chamber concealed within. The chamber itself was created from large upright stones, carefully arranged to support the enormous capstone. The builders had to understand weight, balance, and the strength of the stone. A single mistake could have brought the entire structure down. Yet the main capstone has remained in position for more than 5,000 years. Archaeological excavations have revealed evidence of activity around the monument, including traces associated with the original mound. Human remains have also been connected with the site, although the exact funerary practices carried out here remain difficult to reconstruct. The monument may have been used repeatedly, rather than for a single burial. That possibility is important. Neolithic chambered tombs were often places where communities returned over generations. The dead were not necessarily separated from the living forever. Instead, their remains could remain within a monument that continued to have meaning for the community. Pentre Ifan may therefore have been a place of memory, a location where different generations returned to the same stones. People who had never met the original builders could still have stood beneath the same enormous capstone, continuing traditions that were already centuries old. The surrounding landscape adds another mystery. The Preseli Hills are famous for their unusual spotted dolerite stones, some of which were transported hundreds of kilometers to Stonehenge. Pentre Ifan is much closer to their source, and its connection with the local landscape shows that these stones were already important long before the later monument at Stonehenge. Imagine standing here 5,000 years ago. The mound would have looked fresh, the stones would have been cleaner, and the surrounding landscape would have been managed by small farming communities. People could have approached the monument from the surrounding valleys, carrying offerings, bringing the remains of the dead, or gathering for ceremonies. But we cannot know exactly what happened here. There are no written records, no surviving descriptions of the ceremonies, and no explanation of why this particular place was chosen. The monument gives us evidence, but not the full story. Eventually, the traditions that created Pentre Ifan disappeared. The mound slowly eroded. The chamber became exposed, and vegetation began to surround the stones. Thousands of years passed, while the monument remained almost unchanged. Later generations created their own stories about ancient monuments. The strange arrangement of enormous stones naturally attracted attention, and Pentre Ifan became one of the most recognizable prehistoric monuments in Wales. But its true history is much older than those later traditions. Today, the capstone still appears to balance above the ground, supported by its ancient uprights. The surrounding landscape remains remarkably open, with the Preseli Hills visible behind the monument. It is a peaceful place now, but its original purpose was deeply connected with a very different world. Pentre Ifan is remarkable because so much of its meaning has disappeared, while the stones themselves have survived. The people who built it are unknown. Their language is forgotten. Their ceremonies have vanished, and the original mound has mostly disappeared. But the enormous capstone remains exactly where it was placed thousands of years ago. 3 upright stones still support it, and beneath that ancient roof, the monument continues to preserve the memory of a Neolithic community that transformed a Welsh hillside into a place for the dead. The Dissignac tumulus. On the western coast of France, a huge mound rises quietly from the landscape. From the outside, it looks like a natural hill. But beneath the stones and earth, 2 ancient burial chambers are hidden inside. This is the Dissignac tumulus, a Neolithic monument built more than 6,000 years ago. Dissignac stands near the modern city of Saint-Nazaire, in the region of Loire-Atlantique. The monument dates to around 4700 to 4500 BC, making it one of the oldest known megalithic monuments in the region. It was built long before the Egyptian pyramids, and thousands of years before the great monuments of classical Europe. The first thing that makes Dissignac unusual is how little of the original monument can be seen from outside. The stones are largely hidden beneath a massive mound. Earth, small stones, and carefully arranged layers covered the chambers inside. Only the entrances and parts of the internal structure reveal what lies beneath. Inside the mound, there are 2 separate burial chambers. Each chamber is reached through its own narrow passage. The passages extend into the heart of the monument, leading toward rooms constructed from enormous stone slabs. The builders created an underground world, then sealed it beneath the mound. The chambers were not simply empty rooms. Archaeologists discovered human remains, along with objects that had been deliberately placed inside. Stone tools, pottery, and other artifacts were recovered during excavations. These objects provide clues about the people who created the monument, even though their names and language are completely unknown. One of the most interesting discoveries came from the walls. Some of the stones inside the chambers contain prehistoric engravings. Simple geometric shapes, lines, and mysterious patterns were carved into the stone. Their meaning is uncertain. There are no written explanations, only the marks themselves. The people who built Dissignac were farming communities. They lived during the Neolithic period, when agriculture had already transformed life across much of Western Europe. They grew crops, kept animals, made stone tools, and created permanent settlements. But they also devoted enormous amounts of effort to monuments for the dead. Building Dissignac would have required cooperation. Huge stones had to be selected, moved, positioned, and incorporated into the chambers. Then, the entire structure had to be covered with thousands of stones and earth. This was a major construction project for a prehistoric farming community. The monument also appears to have been built in stages. The 2 chambers were not necessarily created as one identical construction project. Different parts of the monument were added or modified, creating the complex structure that survives today. This suggests that the site may have remained important for generations. Imagine the monument when it was newly completed. The mound would have appeared much more deliberate, its surfaces carefully constructed, its entrances clearly defined. People would have approached the monument across the surrounding landscape, entering the narrow passage, and eventually reaching the dark chamber inside. What happened inside those chambers? We cannot say for certain. The presence of human remains suggests funerary activity, but the monument may also have been a place where communities gathered, remembered ancestors, or performed ceremonies connected with death. The exact rituals have disappeared. Eventually, the monument was sealed. The entrances were closed. The chambers disappeared beneath the mound, and the landscape slowly changed around it. Generations passed, then centuries, then thousands of years. The people who built Dissignac vanished completely from history. For a long time, the mound remained part of the landscape without revealing everything hidden inside. Its true complexity only became clear through archaeological excavation. As researchers removed layers of earth and stone, the passages, chambers, and engraved surfaces gradually emerged. The excavations also revealed just how carefully the monument had been constructed. The stones were arranged into stable walls. The passages were deliberately planned, and the mound itself protected the chambers beneath it. The builders had created something designed to last. Today, Dissignac stands as a quiet reminder of prehistoric life in Western France. The surrounding landscape is completely different from what it was 6,000 years ago, But the monument remains. Beneath the massive mound, the ancient chambers still preserve traces of the people who created them. The Disignac tumulus is remarkable because the greatest part of the monument is hidden. From the outside, it appears to be little more than a huge mound. But underneath, there are stone passages, burial chambers, ancient engravings, and evidence of a community that lived thousands of years before written history. The builders left no names, no explanation, and no record of the ceremonies performed here. They simply left the stones behind, sealed beneath a massive mound, where they remained hidden for thousands of years. The prehistoric fortress of Los Milars, on a rocky plateau in southern Spain, the remains of an enormous prehistoric settlement stretch across the landscape. Massive walls, stone towers, fortified entrances, and hundreds of ancient tombs surround what was once a thriving community. This is Los Milars, one of the most important prehistoric settlements in Europe. Los Milars was established around the 4th millennium BC, in the region of present-day Almeria. The settlement developed on a naturally protected plateau, with steep ground helping defend it from approaching enemies. But the people who lived here did not rely entirely on the landscape. They built an extraordinary system of fortifications. The main settlement was surrounded by thick stone walls, reinforced with semicircular bastions. Several defensive structures were positioned around the settlement, and additional fortified outposts were constructed across the surrounding landscape. The result was much more than a simple village. Los Milars had become a heavily defended prehistoric community. Inside the walls, people lived in circular houses. The buildings were constructed using stone foundations, with lighter materials used for the upper sections. The houses were relatively small, but together they formed a dense settlement. People lived, worked, stored food, and carried out everyday activities within the protected area. The settlement also had an important water supply. Channels were constructed to bring water toward the community, a remarkable achievement for a society living thousands of years ago. Water was essential for drinking, agriculture, animals, and everyday life. Controlling it would have been just as important as controlling the walls. The surrounding landscape was also rich in natural resources. The region contained deposits of copper and other minerals, and metalworking became an important part of the community's economy. Los Milars therefore existed during a period when metallurgy was becoming increasingly important in prehistoric Europe. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of copper production, including tools, fragments, and remains connected with metalworking. This suggests that some inhabitants had specialized knowledge, while others could focus on farming, craft production, or trade. The settlement was becoming socially complex, but perhaps the most remarkable part of Los Milars lies outside the main walls. Across the surrounding slopes, there was an enormous cemetery. Nearly 100 megalithic tombs have been identified around the settlement. Many were built as tholoi, circular burial chambers covered by stone and earth. These tombs were not simple graves. They were carefully constructed monuments, with entrance passages leading into circular chambers. Large stone slabs formed the walls, while smaller stones and earth created the roofs and surrounding mounds. Some tombs were used repeatedly, bringing different generations together in the same monument. The objects discovered inside the tombs reveal something about the people who were buried there. Archaeologists found pottery, stone tools, copper objects, ornaments, and other grave goods. Some decorated vessels contain strange geometric designs, while other objects feature patterns resembling eyes. The presence of valuable objects inside some tombs suggests differences in status. Not everyone may have been buried in exactly the same way, or with the same collection of objects. This has led archaeologists to investigate whether Los Milars had developed significant social differences. The settlement may have been becoming more hierarchical. The defensive system provides another clue. Building walls, towers, and separate fortifications would have required large amounts of organized labor. Someone had to plan the construction, gather workers, move stone, and maintain the defenses. This suggests that the community was capable of considerable coordination. But why did Los Milars need so much protection? We cannot give one definite answer. The fortifications may have protected people from rival communities, controlled access to important resources, or reflected increasing competition during a period of social change. The walls tell us that security mattered, but not exactly what threat the inhabitants feared. Imagine Los Milars when it was occupied. The plateau would have been filled with circular houses, people moving through narrow spaces, smoke rising from fires, animals kept near the settlement, and workers processing copper. Beyond the walls, the cemetery would have covered the surrounding slopes. And further away, smaller fortified structures watched the approaches. The settlement was part of a wider culture, one that spread across parts of southeastern Iberia. Different communities shared architectural traditions, burial practices, pottery styles, and methods of working metal. Los Milars became one of the largest and most important centers within this prehistoric world. Eventually, the settlement declined. The reasons remain uncertain. Environmental changes, shifts in resources, social changes, and changing settlement patterns may all have played a role. The community that maintained the enormous fortifications eventually disappeared. The walls slowly collapsed, the houses disappeared, and the cemetery fell into silence. The landscape returned to something closer to its natural appearance. For thousands of years, the remains of the settlement remained hidden beneath soil and vegetation. Modern archaeological excavations revealed just how extensive the site really was. Walls, bastions, houses, work areas, water systems, and hundreds of tombs gradually emerged. Piece by piece, archaeologists began reconstructing a society that had left no written history. Today, Los Milars provides an extraordinary glimpse into prehistoric Europe. It shows that long before the rise of the great civilizations of the Mediterranean, communities in Iberia were already building fortified settlements, working metals, organizing large construction projects, and creating elaborate monuments for their dead. The Sandbyborg Ring Fort. The fortress was built during the migration period, around the 5th century AD. It was one of several ring forts constructed across the island of Åland. A thick limestone wall surrounded the settlement, creating a protected circular enclosure. Inside, dozens of houses were arranged around streets and open spaces. It was a fortified community, but also a place where people lived ordinary lives. The houses were built from stone and other local materials. Families would have cooked, stored food, worked, and kept animals inside the settlement. The community also appears to have been relatively wealthy. Archaeologists discovered jewelry, glass beads, decorated brooches, and other valuable objects. Some of these items had connections reaching far beyond Åland. Then, something happened. Around the late 5th century, the settlement was violently attacked. The evidence suggests that many inhabitants were killed, and their bodies were left where they fell. They were not given normal burials. They were simply abandoned inside the houses and along the streets of the fortress. That discovery came as a shock. Archaeologists found human remains in several buildings, including the remains of adults, children, and an infant. Some of the skeletons showed injuries consistent with violent attacks. The evidence points toward a sudden episode of interpersonal violence, rather than a gradual abandonment. One of the most disturbing aspects is what happened afterward. The bodies were not buried. The houses were not properly cleared, and the settlement appears not to have been occupied again. The people who survived, if there were survivors, did not return to rebuild the community. Sandbyborg became a place frozen in time. Archaeologists have so far identified at least 26 individuals from the excavated areas. The excavated remains represent people of different ages, from very young children to older adults. The evidence suggests that the attack affected the community broadly, rather than being a battle involving only warriors. Some of the injuries were caused by sharp weapons, while others show blunt force trauma. Many of the injuries were concentrated around the head. This suggests that the violence was direct and close range, but the exact sequence of events remains uncertain. We do not know who attacked the settlement, or exactly why. And that is where the mystery becomes deeper. The fortress contained valuable objects, yet much of that wealth was left behind. Jewelry, glass beads, and other precious possessions remained inside the houses. The attackers do not appear to have completely stripped the settlement. Something other than simple looting may have been taking place. 5 separate deposits of valuable jewelry were also discovered. They included elaborate gilded silver brooches, finger rings, glass beads, and other ornaments. These objects had apparently been hidden inside the settlement. Perhaps their owners were trying to protect them, or perhaps they were buried during the chaos surrounding the attack. We cannot know for certain. The location of Sandbyborg is also unusual. The fortress stands close to the coast, with the Baltic Sea nearby. This may have provided access to maritime routes, but it also left the settlement exposed to people arriving from the water. The surrounding landscape may have been both an advantage and a vulnerability. Imagine the fortress before the attack. People moving through the streets, children inside the houses, animals kept nearby, workers repairing tools, and valuable jewelry hidden safely away. It would have been a functioning community, not a ruin. Then, violence suddenly entered the settlement. The attack may have happened quickly. Some victims appear to have died inside their houses, while others were found in open areas. There is no evidence of a long defensive struggle across the entire settlement. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests a sudden and coordinated assault. But the identity of the attackers remains unknown. The aftermath is perhaps the strangest part. No one came back to bury the dead. No one rebuilt the houses. No later community seems to have taken over the site. The fortress was simply abandoned. Over time, the roofs collapsed, the walls weathered, and vegetation covered the remains. For more than 1,000 years, Sandby Borg remained largely silent. Local people knew the ancient fort existed, but the events that had taken place there were forgotten. Then, archaeological investigations began to reveal what was beneath the soil. Excavations started in the early 21st century, and each new season revealed more of the settlement. Stone houses emerged, jewelry appeared, and human remains began to tell the story of the massacre. The site became an extraordinary archaeological time capsule. What makes Sandby Borg especially valuable is that the destruction preserved details of everyday life. Objects were still lying inside houses, food remains survived, tools were left behind, and possessions remained close to where their owners had kept them. Instead of seeing a settlement slowly abandoned, archaeologists could study a community interrupted by violence. But the biggest question remains unanswered. Who attacked Sandby Borg? There are several possibilities. A rival community, a powerful group seeking control, or attackers arriving from elsewhere across the Baltic. Archaeologists continue to investigate the evidence, but no single explanation has been proven. The massacre also happened during a period of major change across Europe. The Roman Empire had already begun to break apart. Political systems were shifting, and communities around the Baltic were experiencing their own conflicts and transformations. Sandby Borg may have been caught in that wider period of instability. The ancient village beneath Loch Porgasdale. A crannog is an artificial island, usually created in a lake or loch. People built them by placing timber, brushwood, stones, and other materials into the water, gradually creating a raised platform above the lake bed. For centuries, archaeologists believed most Scottish crannogs belonged to much later periods. Loch Porgasdale changed that picture. Excavations revealed that the island had a much older history. The earliest timber structure dates to the early Neolithic period, around 3500 to 3300 BC. That makes it more than 5,000 years old, and roughly contemporary with some of the earliest monumental landscapes of Britain. The discovery was especially surprising because the island looks largely like stone. Archaeologists already knew that timber existed beneath parts of the structure, but excavation revealed something much larger. The wooden material was not simply a few scattered pieces. It formed a substantial construction beneath the stone surface. The earliest structure appears to have been built from layers of brushwood, along with large timbers arranged across the bottom of the loch. The wooden framework created a foundation, and additional material was gradually built above it. The entire construction may have extended roughly 23 meters across. Building something that large in the middle of a loch would have required considerable effort. Trees had to be cut, timbers transported, brushwood collected, and the materials carefully arranged in the water. This was not something that could be created casually. A community had to organize the work. But why build an island here? That remains one of the biggest questions. It may have provided a place for gatherings, special activities, or perhaps habitation. The archaeological evidence does not yet allow us to give one definite answer. Hundreds of fragments of Neolithic pottery have also been discovered in the water surrounding the island. Some of these pieces are extremely early, and they provide important evidence about the people who used the site. The pottery suggests that the island was connected with activity taking place around the loch, rather than simply being an abandoned construction. The water itself became part of the archaeological record. Organic materials that would normally decay on dry land can survive underwater. Wood, plant material, and other fragile remains can remain preserved within waterlogged sediments. This is one reason Loch Porgastale is so valuable. The island was not necessarily used in only one period. Later people returned to the site, and the structure was modified. A new layer of brushwood and stone was added during the Middle Bronze Age, around 2,000 years after the original Neolithic construction. Then, there was further activity during the Iron Age. The same artificial island had therefore remained important across enormous stretches of time. Different communities, separated by generations, returned to the same place. That raises another fascinating possibility. Perhaps the island itself had acquired a special significance. The people who added the later structures may have known that something much older existed beneath them, or they may simply have inherited a location that was already important. We cannot know. Imagine approaching the island thousands of years ago. The loch would have surrounded the wooden platform, the water reflecting the hills of Lewis, while people moved across the artificial surface. Timber structures may have stood above the platform. Although exactly what buildings once occupied, it remains uncertain. The island's location also made access difficult. A person could not simply walk onto it from the surrounding landscape. The water created a natural separation. A stone causeway was later associated with the site, providing a connection between the shore and the artificial island. This separation may have been intentional. Across Britain and Ireland, artificial islands sometimes appear to have had special social or defensive roles. But crannogs were not all built for the same reason. Some were homes, some were places of refuge, and others may have been associated with gatherings or ritual activities. Loch Porgastale may have served a function we still do not fully understand. The archaeological investigation has also been technically challenging. Parts of the structure lie underwater, meaning researchers have had to excavate both above and below the waterline. They have used underwater surveys, core sampling, timber analysis, and detailed digital mapping to understand the island. These methods revealed something that would have been almost impossible to see from the surface. The stone island was only the upper part of a much more complicated structure. Beneath it, the remains of an ancient timber platform were still preserved. The discovery changes the way we understand Neolithic communities in Scotland. These people were capable of working with large quantities of timber, organizing construction projects, and creating artificial landscapes in the middle of lakes. They were not simply living beside nature. They were actively reshaping it. And perhaps the most remarkable detail is how long the location remained important. The original builders disappeared. Centuries passed, and later communities returned to the same artificial island. The structure was modified, expanded, and used again. Eventually, the island fell silent. The people disappeared. The timber became buried beneath layers of stone and sediment, and the loch continued to cover the remains. For thousands of years, the oldest parts of the structure remained hidden underwater. Only modern archaeology revealed the full story. What looked like a simple stone island turned out to be a complicated prehistoric construction. A wooden foundation, brushwood layers, stone, pottery, and evidence of repeated activity were all preserved beneath the water. The underground tombs of Angaluruju. In the countryside of northern Sardinia, a quiet valley hides one of the largest prehistoric burial sites on the island. From the surface, there is little to suggest what lies beneath, but cut into the sandstone, dozens of underground chambers disappear into the earth. These are the Domus de Janas, the mysterious prehistoric tombs of Angaluruju. The necropolis lies near the modern city of Alghero, not far from the Mediterranean coast. It contains 38 separate underground tombs, carved directly into the sandstone. The earliest chambers date to around 3200 BC, and the site continued to be used for many centuries afterward. The name Domus de Janas means houses of the fairies. The name comes from much later Sardinian folklore, when local traditions imagined these strange underground chambers as homes belonging to tiny supernatural beings. But their original purpose was much more serious. They were created as places for the dead. The people who built them had no metal tools. They worked the sandstone using stone tools, removing the rock piece by piece, until an underground chamber slowly emerged. Some of the excavated tombs even preserved the stone picks that had been used to create them. The tombs are not all identical. Some begin with narrow shaft-like entrances, leading down into irregular chambers. Others have a longer open passage, known as a dromos, leading toward a more organized underground complex. Inside, multiple chambers could be connected together. The deeper you go, the more carefully the architecture appears to have been designed. Walls were shaped, corners were created, and some chambers were given details that imitate ordinary houses: doorways, beams, columns, and other architectural features were carved directly into the stone. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of Angalu-Ruju. The tombs were not simply holes in the ground. They were designed to resemble places where people lived. The dead were being given their own underground spaces, almost like houses beneath the earth. Some chambers contain carved symbols, including horns and animal-like forms. False doors also appear in several tombs. These entrances do not lead anywhere. They are symbolic doorways carved into the walls. Their exact meaning is uncertain, but they appear to have been connected with ideas about death and the afterlife. Red ochre was also used inside some of the tombs. The vivid pigment would have stood out against the pale sandstone, giving the chambers a completely different appearance when they were newly created. The color may have carried symbolic associations with life, blood, or regeneration, but the exact beliefs behind it are unknown. The tombs also contained objects placed with the dead: pottery, ornaments, necklaces, small figurines, and other artifacts were discovered during archaeological excavations. These objects provide clues about the communities that used the necropolis, even though their names and written history have been lost. Among the discoveries were figurines associated with the Mother Goddess tradition. These small objects may have had religious significance, although their precise role remains uncertain. They suggest that the burial rituals were connected with a wider system of beliefs, one that archaeologists can only partially reconstruct. The necropolis was not used for just a few generations. Evidence suggests that the tombs remained important for roughly 1500 years, from the later Neolithic period, through the Copper Age, and into the early Bronze Age. Different generations returned to the same underground spaces. That means the tombs may have become places of collective memory. Ancestors were buried beneath the same landscape, while later generations continued to visit the chambers. The relationship between the living and the dead was therefore not simply a moment at the time of burial. It continued across centuries. Imagine entering one of these tombs thousands of years ago. The entrance would have been freshly carved, the walls sharply defined, and the red pigment would have been far more visible. A small group of people could descend into the darkness, carrying the remains of someone who had died. They would pass through the narrow entrance, then disappear into the underground chambers. Outside, the landscape would have looked very different. The surrounding countryside was being used by farming communities, with fields, animals, and settlements spread across northern Sardinia. The necropolis formed part of that wider landscape, a place where the community returned when someone died. Eventually, the tradition changed. New burial practices appeared. Communities developed new technologies, and the ancient Domus de Janus were no longer being created in the same way. The tombs remained, but their original purpose gradually became forgotten. For thousands of years, the underground chambers remained hidden. The entrances became difficult to recognize. Vegetation covered parts of the landscape, and the people who knew their original purpose disappeared. Then, in 1903, the necropolis was discovered by archaeologists. Excavations revealed just how extensive the site was. One chamber led to another. Stone surfaces revealed carvings, and artifacts began to emerge from the ancient burial spaces. The underground world of Angalu-Ruju slowly became visible again. Today, the 38 tombs form one of the most important prehistoric funerary complexes in Sardinia. The chambers are quiet now, but the architecture still preserves traces of the people who created them. Every carved doorway, every artificial chamber, and every surviving symbol provides another clue. The burial towers of Cutimbo. Cutimbo lies in the Puno region of southern Peru, on a high plateau surrounded by mountains and open grassland. The location is remote, and the altitude is extreme. Yet people were using this landscape for thousands of years. The oldest evidence includes ancient rock paintings, while the main monumental structures belong to much later periods. The most striking features are the cholpas, funerary towers built from stone. They appear across the highlands around Lake Titicaca, but the examples at Cutimbo are particularly impressive. Some are relatively simple, while others were constructed with carefully fitted blocks of volcanic stone. the largest towers are not perfectly identical. Some have circular forms, others are more rectangular, and several contain carefully shaped doorways. The builders used different types of stone, including dark volcanic rock and lighter volcanic material. The contrast can make some of the monuments appear almost patterned. The entrances are another fascinating detail. Many of the cholpas have small trapezoidal openings, generally facing toward the east. That direction is significant because it is associated with the rising sun. The exact meaning of this orientation is uncertain, but it suggests that the relationship between the tombs and the landscape was carefully considered. Inside the towers, there were spaces where the dead could be placed. Some of the larger structures contain niches, platforms, and other architectural features. Funerary bundles may have been positioned within these chambers, surrounded by objects connected with the people who had been buried there. These were not ordinary graves. The cholpas were monumental structures, visible across the landscape. They marked the resting places of people who had held important positions within their communities. The tomb itself became a permanent statement of status, memory, and ancestry. Cutimbo was closely associated with the Lupaca and Kala societies, and the site was later incorporated into the expanding Inca world. This means that the monuments represent several stages of Andean history, rather than a single civilization existing at one moment. The main period of monumental construction belongs roughly to the late intermediate period, between about the 11th and 15th centuries AD. Later, during the 15th and early 16th centuries, the Incas occupied the region. Some of the funerary structures were therefore connected with a landscape that continued to have importance under Inca rule. The stonework can be remarkably sophisticated. Some of the larger cholpas were built from carefully fitted blocks, with stones shaped to create stable walls. Certain surfaces also contained carved animal forms, including snakes, felines, and other creatures. These decorations give the towers a distinctive appearance. But perhaps the most interesting detail is that Cutimbo was not only a cemetery. The site also contains ceremonial spaces, walls, open areas, and other structures associated with ritual activity. The dead were therefore part of a much larger sacred landscape. Imagine approaching Cutimbo centuries ago. The towers would have stood above the high plateau, their stone walls catching the sunlight, with mountains stretching across the horizon. People could approach the tombs, perform ceremonies, and interact with the remains of their ancestors. The landscape itself would have been part of the experience. Some of the tombs were used repeatedly. Instead of being sealed forever after one burial, they could become places where later generations returned. New burials could be added, while older ancestors remained within the same structure. The tomb therefore connected different generations. This relationship with ancestors was extremely important in the Andes. The dead were not necessarily viewed as completely separated from the living. Their remains could continue to hold social and religious significance. A powerful ancestor could remain part of the community, even after death. Archaeological excavations have also revealed evidence of changing political relationships. Research at Cutimbo has shown differences in wealth, burial practices, and monument construction. These differences provide clues about social divisions within the communities, as well as the changes that occurred after Inca expansion. The site also contains earlier evidence. Rock shelters and painted surfaces show that people were using the area long before the great cholpas appeared. This means Cutimbo was already part of the human landscape, long before the monumental towers transformed it. Eventually, the world that created the cholpas changed. Spanish conquest brought another enormous transformation to the Andes, and the traditional systems surrounding these monuments were disrupted. The ceremonies ended, but the stone towers remained. For centuries, the cholpas stood against the harsh Andean climate. Cold nights, strong sunlight, heavy seasonal weather, and powerful winds slowly affected the stone. But many of the structures remain surprisingly well preserved. Today, the towers still dominate the highland landscape. They are quiet, surrounded by grass and distant mountains. There are no processions approaching them now, and the people who once performed ceremonies here are long gone. But the monuments still communicate their importance. Cutimbo is remarkable because its towers were built not simply to bury the dead, but to keep them visible. The cholpas turned burial into architecture, and ancestry into part of the landscape. The people who created them left no written explanation of every ceremony, but their stone towers remain, standing above the Peruvian highlands, where they have watched over the landscape for centuries. And perhaps that was their purpose all along, to make sure that even after the people themselves were gone, their ancestors would never completely disappear. The stone tomb of La Lentejuela, in the hills of southern Spain, a huge prehistoric mound hides a remarkable stone tomb beneath the earth. From the outside, it is easy to imagine nothing more than an ancient hill. But beneath that mound, a carefully constructed burial monument stretches deep into the ground. This is Dolmen I of La Lentejuela, a prehistoric tomb discovered in the megalithic necropolis near Tiba, Malaga. The tomb is more than 5,000 years old, dating to the later Neolithic period. It stretches for roughly 13 meters, with large upright stones forming its walls and enormous slabs creating its roof. For thousands of years, the structure remained protected beneath the mound that once covered it. The tomb was not a simple chamber. It was carefully divided into different internal spaces, with a long passage leading toward the burial areas. The architecture was designed to guide movement from the outside, deep into the monument, until reaching the spaces where the dead were placed. The excavation revealed that several people had been buried within the structure. Their remains were placed in different areas, suggesting that the tomb was used repeatedly. This was not simply a monument built for one individual. It became a place where a community could return to bury its dead. But the most surprising discoveries came from the objects found alongside the human remains. Archaeologists recovered pottery, stone tools, shells, and objects made from materials that did not originate nearby. Among the most remarkable were pieces of ivory and amber. These materials are important because they reveal something about the world beyond the tomb. Ivory was not a local material in southern Spain, and amber could also travel considerable distances. Their presence suggests that the people connected with La Lentejuela participated in exchange networks extending far beyond their immediate surroundings. The seashells are equally interesting. The tomb lies inland, yet marine shells were deliberately placed among the burial objects. This shows that objects connected with the sea could travel deep into the interior, where they could become valuable possessions or funerary offerings. The objects therefore tell a story that the stones alone cannot. The people who built this monument were not isolated. They were connected to other communities, moving materials, objects, and ideas across large parts of the prehistoric landscape. The architecture itself also contains an unusual detail. The passage does not form one perfectly straight line. Near the entrance, its direction changes. The builders deliberately created an angled approach, before the passage continues deeper toward the burial chambers. Why was it built this way? There is no definite answer. It may have been connected with the landscape, the position of the entrance, or the practical construction of the monument. The unusual layout remains one of the features archaeologists continue to study. The roof was constructed from large stone slabs. Some of these slabs survived, although several were fractured beneath the weight of the mound. The builders had created a massive structure, then covered it with earth and stone. From a distance, the tomb would have appeared as a large artificial mound. Imagine approaching La Lentejuela thousands of years ago. You would not have seen an exposed stone tomb like the one archaeologists see today. Instead, a monumental mound would have dominated the landscape. A narrow entrance would have led inside. And beyond it, the darkness of the burial chambers. The people entering the tomb would have been entering a place connected with generations of ancestors. The dead were not simply hidden beneath the ground. They were placed inside a monument that remained visible within the landscape. The mound itself became a permanent marker. La Lentejuela is part of a larger megalithic cemetery, with numerous prehistoric structures spread across the surrounding area. The tombs were built at different times, and their designs are not all identical. Together, they reveal a long tradition of monumental burial in this part of southern Iberia. The site continued to be used and modified over time. Later communities returned to some of these monuments, changing the way the burial spaces were used. This means the structures were not frozen in a single moment. Their meaning could change as generations passed. Eventually, the people who maintained the monuments disappeared. The entrances became blocked. The stones became covered, and the great mound slowly blended into the surrounding landscape. The tomb remained hidden beneath the earth, while the communities that created it faded from memory. Modern archaeological work has now begun revealing the monument again. Excavations, detailed mapping, and three-dimensional recording have allowed researchers to document the structure in much greater detail. Each layer removed from the mound reveals another part of its story, and the story is becoming increasingly interesting. La Lentejuela shows that prehistoric communities in southern Spain were capable of monumental construction, complex burial practices, and long-distance exchange. They were building enormous stone tombs, while objects from distant regions were reaching their communities. Yet many questions remain. Who exactly was buried inside? Why were particular objects selected as offerings? What did the unusual passage represent? And what ceremonies took place inside the chamber? The stones provide clues, but they cannot give us the complete answer. The prehistoric fortress of Walcamp. In the wetlands of Shropshire, England, a strange ancient fortress once stood on an island. Not an island surrounded by the sea, but a raised piece of dry ground surrounded by marsh. Today, much of that landscape has disappeared, but the earthworks of the fortress still remain. This is Walcamp at Kinnersley, one of Britain's unusual Iron Age marsh forts. Walcamp stands in what was once a huge wetland known as the Weald Moors. The surrounding ground was covered by fen, peat, and shallow water. The settlement itself occupied a natural elevated island, only a few meters higher than the surrounding landscape. That unusual position gave the inhabitants a natural form of protection. Unlike most famous Iron Age forts, Walcamp was not built on a dramatic hilltop. It was built in the lowlands. The island was surrounded by wet ground, making it difficult for anyone approaching from outside. The builders then added their own defenses, creating several enormous banks and ditches around the settlement. The fort covered roughly 12 hectares, making it surprisingly large. Its outer defenses formed a complicated series of concentric earthworks, with banks and ditches surrounding the central enclosure. From above, the layout resembles a series of enormous rings spreading across the landscape. The inner rampart followed the shape of the natural island. In some places, the earthwork was several meters high. Beyond it, additional banks and ditches created further lines of defense. The defenses were also modified over time, suggesting that the fortress did not remain exactly the same throughout its occupation. At least two entrances appear to have provided access to the interior. One was approached by a causeway crossing the surrounding wetland. Another entrance was later created through the outer defenses. These causeways are particularly interesting because they controlled the few practical routes into the settlement. Inside the fortress, archaeologists discovered evidence of buildings. Excavations revealed circular structures, along with rectangular post-built buildings. These may have been used for different purposes, including domestic activities and storage. So Walcamp was not simply a defensive enclosure. People actually lived here. Pottery discovered inside the fort provides important clues about its inhabitants. Some of the pottery was locally produced, while other pieces appear to have come from farther away. Among the finds was a particularly coarse type of pottery associated with salt production in Cheshire. This suggests that Walcamp was connected to wider networks of exchange. Salt was an important resource in Iron Age Britain. It could be used to preserve food, and communities involved in salt production could trade it for other goods. The pottery found at Walcamp therefore gives us a glimpse of connections extending beyond the surrounding marshes. The settlement appears to have been occupied from around the 3rd century BC, continuing into the period just before the Roman conquest. That means people may have lived here for several generations. During that time, the defenses could have been repaired, modified, and strengthened. But why build such a large fort in a wetland? The natural landscape may have been the most important reason. The marsh created an enormous defensive barrier, while the elevated island provided a dry place for settlement. The surrounding wetlands may also have supplied fish, birds, plants, and other resources. Imagine approaching Walcamp during the Iron Age. Instead of seeing a simple road leading toward a settlement, you would encounter marshland. Water and soft ground surrounded the raised island. Beyond the wetlands, the defensive banks would have appeared above the landscape. To reach the settlement, you had to follow a controlled route across the wet ground. Inside, the atmosphere would have been very different. Roundhouses stood across the settlement. People worked. Food was prepared. Animals were kept. And goods were stored. The fort was a community, not simply a military stronghold. The surrounding wetland also created unusual archaeological possibilities. Waterlogged ground can preserve organic materials that normally disappear. Wood, seeds, plant remains. and other fragile materials can survive beneath peat and buried ditches. This means the landscape around Wall Camp may still contain evidence of everyday Iron Age life. Over time, the wetland changed. The peat was drained. The landscape was converted into farmland, and the ancient island became much less obvious. What had once been surrounded by marsh was gradually connected with the modern landscape. The fortress remained, but its original setting had almost disappeared. For centuries, the earthworks were simply part of the landscape. Farmers worked around them. Roads crossed parts of the ancient defenses, and sections of the ramparts were reduced by cultivation. Yet much of the structure survived beneath the ground. Archaeological excavations eventually revealed more. Researchers discovered evidence of multiple construction phases, buildings, pottery, and buried features. The more they investigated, the clearer it became that Wall Camp was far more complex than its appearance suggested. And there is still much we do not know. We do not know exactly why this particular island was chosen, who controlled the settlement, or what threats the fortifications were designed to resist. The massive defenses suggest that security mattered, but they do not tell us who the enemies were. The fort may also have had a social role. A settlement of this size could have been an important center for the surrounding communities. People may have gathered here, traded goods, stored food, or taken part in activities that brought different groups together. The walls could have protected more than houses. They could have protected a community's wealth and identity. Eventually, the settlement was abandoned. The people left. The buildings collapsed, and the defensive banks slowly weathered. The marsh continued changing around the ancient island. Centuries passed, then more than 1,000 years. The village that simply walked away. Warham Percy was occupied for roughly 6 centuries. Its origins probably go back to the 9th or 10th century, although people had already been using the surrounding landscape much earlier. By the medieval period, the settlement had developed into a substantial farming community. There were rows of peasant houses, manor buildings, a church, and agricultural fields stretching across the valley. At its height, around 40 peasant houses may have stood here. The population could have reached roughly 200 people. Families lived in longhouses, worked the surrounding fields, raised animals, and depended on the land for almost everything. For generations, Warham Percy was simply home. At the center of the settlement stood St. Martin's Church. The church was rebuilt and modified several times, and its history stretches across many centuries. Nearby, 2 manor complexes belonged to powerful landowners. The arrangement reveals something about medieval village life. The peasants worked the land, while the local lords controlled much of the estate. There was also a watermill. The mill pond provided power for grinding grain, and later became useful for fishing and keeping livestock. The village was therefore more than a collection of houses. It was an organized agricultural community, with its own religious center, manors, fields, water resources, and working infrastructure. Then, the village began to decline. The process was not sudden. There was no single night when everyone packed their belongings and disappeared. Instead, the population gradually became smaller. Some houses were abandoned, some fields were left uncultivated, and parts of the village began to fall into disrepair. The 14th century brought difficult years, bad harvests, economic problems, and wider instability affected communities across England. Warham Percy also experienced disruption connected with the Scottish raids of the early 14th century. By the 1320s, large parts of the village's farmland were no longer being cultivated. Several properties stood empty, and the watermills had fallen out of use. But the village recovered to some degree. By the later 14th century, around 30 houses were occupied again. The fields were being cultivated. One of the mills was operating, and the community continued. So Warham Percy was not simply destroyed by one disaster. Its decline was much more complicated. Then another change began to reshape the English countryside. Wool became extremely valuable. Landowners increasingly found that raising sheep could be more profitable than growing crops. Large areas of farmland were converted into pasture, and this created a serious problem for farming villages. Warham Percy was caught in that transformation. Fields that had once been divided among farming families were gradually turned over to sheep. The land needed fewer workers. Fewer houses were required, and families began to lose their place in the village. Some were evicted, some left, and some houses were demolished. By around 1500, the village had become dramatically smaller. But even then, a few people remained. Smallholders, shepherds, and other inhabitants continued living among the increasingly empty buildings. The village was disappearing, but it did not vanish all at once. In 1527, the remaining arable strips were finally converted to pasture. A few years later, records describe an extraordinary transformation. Around 1,240 sheep were being kept on the former village farmland, under the care of only 2 shepherds. Think about what that means. For generations, the valley had been filled with families. Children, farmers, craftsmen, and workers had depended on those fields. Now, the same landscape supported huge numbers of sheep, but almost none of the people who had once lived there. The village had effectively been replaced by pasture. Eventually, the last inhabitants disappeared. The houses collapsed, roofs vanished, walls were dismantled, and vegetation slowly covered the remains. The church survived longer than most of the buildings, becoming the most obvious reminder that a village had once stood here. For centuries, the landscape remained quiet. People knew there had once been a settlement, but the full story of Warren Percy was buried beneath the fields. Then, in the 20th century, archaeologists began investigating the site in extraordinary detail. Excavations continued for decades, revealing the layout of the medieval village. The excavations uncovered the foundations of houses, manor buildings, work areas, the watermill, and hundreds of graves around the church. Thousands of objects were also recovered, providing unusually detailed evidence of medieval rural life. The human remains revealed another side of the story. Hundreds of skeletons were recovered from the church and graveyard. They provided evidence about health, diet, disease, injuries, and the difficult conditions faced by medieval villagers. The village, therefore, became something more than a collection of ruins. It became a record of ordinary people. People whose names rarely appear in medieval history, but whose houses, tools, food, and remains survived beneath the soil. Archaeology allowed their lives to be reconstructed piece by piece. Imagine walking through Warren Percy when it was still alive. The church bell ringing across the valley, smoke rising from the houses, animals moving through the lanes, farmers returning from the fields, and children growing up among buildings that had stood there for generations. Nothing about the place would have suggested that one day, almost all of it would disappear. Yet that is exactly what happened, not through one enormous catastrophe, but through gradual economic and social change. The village became less useful to its landowners. Its farmland became more valuable as pasture, and its houses became obstacles to a different kind of landscape. The warship that sank on its first voyage. Vasa was built in the early 17th century, during a period when Sweden was becoming a major military power around the Baltic Sea. King Gustav II Adolf ordered the ship to strengthen the Swedish navy, and the vessel was designed to carry an enormous collection of guns. It was meant to be impressive, powerful, and unmistakably royal. The ship itself was a remarkable piece of craftsmanship. Its hull was built mainly from oak, and its exterior was covered with elaborate carvings. Kings, warriors, mythological figures, animals, and other decorative forms covered the ship. These were not simply decorations. They helped communicate the power and ambitions of the Swedish monarchy. Vasa was around 69 meters long and carried 64 guns. 2 gun decks gave the ship an enormous amount of firepower, making it one of the most heavily armed warships of its time. But all that power came with a problem. The ship was extremely tall, and much of its weight sat high above the water. The builders were aware that the ship had stability problems. A test was carried out while the ship was still in the harbor. 30 men ran from one side of the deck to the other, causing the ship to roll dangerously. The demonstration was stopped, but the construction continued. The ship had already taken years to build, and there was enormous pressure to get it into service. Then came the day of its maiden voyage, August 10th, 1628. Crowds gathered along the Stockholm waterfront. Small boats moved around the enormous warship, and Vasa began its first journey. The sails were raised, The ship moved away from the shore, and everything appeared to be going according to plan. Then, a gust of wind pushed the ship sideways. Vasa leaned sharply. The ship recovered slightly, but then the wind struck again. This time, the ship could not recover. Water began rushing through the open gun ports on the lower deck. Within minutes, the enormous warship disappeared beneath Stockholm's harbor. The voyage had lasted only a few minutes. Around 30 people died in the disaster. For the Swedish Navy, it was an extraordinary humiliation. A ship created to demonstrate military strength had failed almost immediately. And then, the harbor swallowed it. Attempts were made to recover Vasa. Divers worked around the wreck, and some of its valuable guns were eventually salvaged. But the ship itself remained underwater. Years became decades. Decades became centuries. The location of Vasa was eventually forgotten. Yet the ship had not completely disappeared. The cold, low-oxygen waters of the Baltic helped preserve the wooden hull. Marine organisms that normally destroy wooden wrecks were far less active in these conditions. As a result, the ship remained remarkably intact beneath the water. More than 300 years passed. Then, a Swedish researcher named Anders Franzén became determined to find the lost warship. He studied historical records, searched the harbor, and investigated the seabed. For years, he refused to give up. In 1956, Franzén finally located Vasa. The discovery confirmed that the legendary warship had survived beneath Stockholm. But finding the ship was only the beginning. Raising a massive wooden vessel that had spent more than 3 centuries underwater would be an enormous engineering challenge. Divers began preparing the wreck. Tunnels were dug beneath the hull. Steel cables were passed underneath, and lifting operations gradually brought the ship toward the surface. Then, on April 24th, 1961, Vasa finally emerged from the water. After 333 years beneath the harbor, the ship saw daylight again. What followed was one of the largest archaeological recovery projects of its kind. Thousands of objects were discovered inside and around the ship. Weapons, tools, clothing, coins, food remains, personal possessions, and pieces of equipment all helped reveal what life was like aboard a 17th century warship. The ship itself was also extraordinarily well preserved. More than 98% of the surviving vessel is original material. The carvings were carefully documented. Fragments were recovered, and missing sections were reconstructed where necessary. Slowly, the warship began to look like the vessel that had sailed out of Stockholm in 1628. But preserving Vasa after its recovery created another problem. A wooden ship that has spent centuries underwater cannot simply be left to dry. The timber had absorbed enormous amounts of water, and uncontrolled drying could cause the wood to shrink and crack. Conservators therefore spent decades developing ways to stabilize the ship. The work continues even today. Researchers monitor the timber, study changes in the wood, and constantly look for ways to protect the ship for future generations. Vasa is not simply an object sitting inside a museum. It is an ongoing conservation project. Walking around the ship today, it is difficult to believe that it spent 333 years beneath the water. The enormous hull rises above the visitors. The carved figures cover the stern, and the scale of the vessel becomes obvious. Yet the ship never became the weapon it was intended to be. It never reached the battlefield. It never became the flagship of the Swedish fleet. It never fought the enemies it had been designed to defeat. Its entire military career ended almost as soon as it began. And that failure is exactly what preserved it for us. Had Vasa sailed successfully for decades, it would eventually have been repaired, modified, damaged, and perhaps destroyed. Instead, it sank on its first voyage. The seabed became its unexpected time capsule. The leather shoes of Vindolanda. Near the ancient frontier of Roman Britain, archaeologists uncovered something surprisingly ordinary. Shoes. Not one or two, but thousands of them. Leather boots, sandals, children's shoes, and footwear made for soldiers. They had been buried in the ground for nearly 2,000 years, and the wet soil of Vindolanda had preserved them remarkably well. Vindolanda was a Roman fort and settlement just south of Hadrian's Wall, built along the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. The fort was occupied for centuries, with different buildings and communities repeatedly replacing earlier ones. In fact, Vindolanda was rebuilt many times during its Roman occupation. But beneath the ruins, the archaeologists found something that can tell us about the people themselves. Their shoes. Around 5,000 leather shoes have been recovered from Vindolanda, making the collection one of the most extraordinary groups of Roman footwear ever discovered. They range from tiny children's shoes to delicate women's footwear to heavy marching boots used by soldiers. Every pair belonged to someone who once walked through this frontier settlement. The preservation is possible because of the unusual conditions beneath the site. Some archaeological layers contained very little oxygen, helping organic materials such as leather survive when they normally would have completely disappeared. That is why objects that would rarely survive elsewhere can still be found at Vindolanda. The shoes reveal surprisingly personal details. Their different sizes show that men, women, and children were living at the settlement. Their shapes also reveal different activities. Some were practical military footwear, others were lighter sandals, and some were carefully decorated. The Roman frontier was not populated only by soldiers. It was a community. Some shoes even preserve the marks of their construction. Roman footwear was often assembled from several layers of leather, with iron studs securing the soles. The position of those studs was important, providing both support and grip while walking. A well-preserved shoe can therefore reveal how its owner moved through the ancient settlement. One particularly interesting example is a woman's shoe, smaller and more delicate than the heavy military footwear. Its sole still preserves a carefully arranged pattern of studs. It may have belonged to one of the women living at Vindolanda, a reminder that the frontier was home to ordinary families as well as soldiers. Other footwear was designed for marching. Soldiers stationed here could spend long periods traveling across rough ground, carrying equipment, walking through mud, and moving along the roads of northern Britain. Their shoes had to survive that life. The worn leather and reinforced soles therefore preserve something about the daily routine of Roman soldiers. Vindolanda has also produced evidence of unusual footwear. Researchers are studying wooden clogs, some of which preserve their original leather uppers. These may have been used around bathhouses, where wooden soles could protect the feet from hot or wet surfaces. The exact uses of some examples are still being investigated. The leather discoveries also reveal that footwear was being made locally. Archaeologists have found tools associated with leatherworking, including awls, scrapers, and needles. Leather scraps and offcuts were also preserved. Together, they suggest that craftsmen were producing and repairing leather goods inside the settlement. One fascinating object is a leatherworker's workbench, dating to around AD 105 to 120. The name 8TO is carved into its surface, surrounded by marks left by tools used to work leather. The cuts and punched shapes may even relate to the production of footwear. It is an unusually direct connection between an ancient craftsman, his workplace, and the objects that were being produced. The shoes also remind us that Roman Britain was not an abstract frontier. People walked these roads. Children grew up here. Workers repaired clothing. Craftsmen made shoes. And soldiers traveled through the gates carrying equipment. A discarded shoe can therefore tell a very different story from a monument. It tells us about someone's everyday life. Eventually, the Roman occupation of Britain ended. The fort was abandoned, buildings collapsed, and vegetation gradually covered the settlement. But the wet archaeological layers protected the leather. The shoes remained underground, waiting for archaeologists centuries later. Today, thousands of these shoes are preserved in the Vindolanda collection. Each one is different. Some are worn. Some are damaged, some are beautifully decorated, and some are little more than fragments. Yet together, they create an unusually detailed picture of life on the Roman frontier. The leather shoes of Vindolanda may not look as impressive as a Roman temple or fortress, but they reveal something those monuments cannot. They show the people who actually lived there, the soldier walking toward the frontier, the woman moving through the settlement, the child growing up beside the fort, and the craftsman making footwear in his workshop. Nearly 2,000 years later, their buildings are mostly ruins. Their voices are gone, but their shoes remain. Quiet traces of ordinary footsteps, still preserved beneath the ancient frontier of Roman Britain. The ancient city of Harran. Harran lies roughly 48 kilometers south of Şanlıurfa, near the modern border with Syria. Its position was extremely important. Ancient routes connected Mesopotamia with northern Syria and the Mediterranean, and Harran stood directly within this network. For thousands of years, Merchants, travelers, armies, and scholars passed through the region. The city's history reaches deep into antiquity. Haran appears in ancient Mesopotamian records, and its name became closely connected with the worship of the moon god Sin. A major temple dedicated to the moon god once stood here, making Haran an important religious center. The city was not simply a place where people lived, it was a place where people came to worship. The location also helped Haran survive through different empires. Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Romans, and later Islamic dynasties all controlled the region at different times. Each period left traces behind, creating a city built layer upon layer. During the Roman and Byzantine periods, Haran continued to occupy an important position in northern Mesopotamia. The city developed its own walls, gates, religious buildings, and public structures. But its greatest transformation came after the rise of Islam. By the medieval period, Haran had become an important center of learning. Scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and other fields. The city became especially famous for its intellectual tradition, and its scholars contributed to the preservation and development of ancient knowledge. One of Haran's most remarkable institutions was its great center of learning, often referred to as the Haran School. Scholars working in the city studied ancient Greek and Near Eastern texts, preserving knowledge that could otherwise have disappeared. Haran therefore became connected not only with ancient religion, but with the history of science and scholarship. The city itself was protected by massive walls. Large gates controlled movement into the settlement, while a powerful citadel dominated the center. Much of the medieval city has disappeared, but sections of the walls, the citadel, and other ruins still survive. Then, Haran suffered one of the great turning points in its history. In the 13th century, Mongol armies reached the region. The city was devastated, and much of its population disappeared. Haran never fully recovered its former importance. The once thriving city gradually became a much smaller settlement. Its great institutions disappeared, its commercial importance declined, and many of its monumental buildings fell into ruin. But something unusual survived: the distinctive houses. The famous beehive houses of Haran are built from mud brick, with thick walls and conical domes. The domes are constructed by gradually projecting bricks inward, until the opening at the top can be closed. No timber framework is needed. The design also works remarkably well in Haran's extreme climate. The thick walls help protect the interior from the intense summer heat, while the shape of the domes allows warm air to rise. Several domed units can also be connected together, creating larger homes for families. The appearance of these houses is extraordinary. From a distance, they look like a field of stone and mud beehives, but they were once ordinary homes, where families cooked, worked, stored food, and lived their daily lives. The strange architecture also has a much deeper history. Similar domed structures have long been associated with Haran, and ancient artistic evidence suggests that domed buildings were known in the region thousands of years ago. The houses seen today are much more recent, but they preserve an architectural tradition connected with the ancient landscape. Imagine Haran centuries ago, the city walls surrounding a busy settlement, merchants arriving with animals and goods, scholars discussing astronomy, worshippers visiting sacred places, and narrow streets winding between mud brick buildings. Beyond the city, the dry plains stretched toward Mesopotamia. The city's location meant that Haran was constantly connected to the wider world. Ideas could travel along the same routes as goods. Languages mixed. Religions encountered one another, and scholars could gain access to texts and traditions from distant civilizations. But the landscape could also be harsh. Rainfall is limited. Summer temperatures can become extreme, and water has always been one of the most important resources in the region. The architecture of Haran developed partly in response to these conditions. The buildings were designed for the environment, rather than against it. Today, the ancient ruins and the surviving domed houses exist side by side. The great city that once stood here is mostly gone, but its foundations remain beneath the landscape. The citadel rises above the ruins, ancient walls cross the fields, and the unusual houses preserve a tradition that is still recognizable. Haran is remarkable because its story cannot be reduced to one civilization. It was Mesopotamian, Assyrian, Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, and eventually part of the modern Turkish landscape. Each period left something behind. The city also reminds us how fragile centers of knowledge can be. For centuries, Harran was connected with scholarship and learning. Its scholars studied ideas that had traveled across civilizations. Then war and political change transformed the city, and much of that world disappeared. Harran is a place where the remains of a very old city still sit beneath an unusual living tradition. The ancient temples are gone, the scholars have disappeared, the great medieval city has fallen into ruins, but the distinctive domed houses remain. They stand across the dry landscape, looking almost like giant beehives, quiet reminders of a city that once connected the worlds of Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, and the wider Islamic world. And beneath those houses, the ancient layers of Harran are still waiting to reveal what happened here thousands of years ago. The unfinished Temple of Apollo at Didyma. Didyma was not originally a normal city. It was a sacred sanctuary, located about 10 kilometers from the ancient city of Miletus. A long, sacred road connected the sanctuary with the city, allowing pilgrims to travel between the two places. For centuries, people came here seeking answers from Apollo. The sanctuary existed long before the enormous temple that stands today. Archaeological evidence reaches back to the 8th century BC, and the earliest sanctuary appears to have developed around a sacred spring and grove. Over time, Didyma became one of the most famous prophetic centers of the ancient Mediterranean. The Oracle of Apollo was the heart of the sanctuary. People came from different parts of the ancient world, bringing questions about their lives, their cities, wars, journeys, and political decisions. The answers were delivered through the sacred traditions of the sanctuary, making Didyma an important religious center far beyond Ionia. The earliest monumental temple was built during the Archaic period. It was already an enormous structure, but it did not survive for long. The temple was destroyed during the Persian Wars, while another monumental building was still being developed. For a time, the sanctuary appears to have lost much of its former importance. Then, a remarkable change took place. In the late 4th century BC, the sanctuary began to recover. The sacred spring returned, and construction began on a completely new Temple of Apollo. This new building would become enormous, much larger than its predecessors. The architects designed a dipteral temple, meaning that 2 rows of columns surrounded the main structure. The scale was extraordinary. The temple was planned with more than 100 enormous columns, each rising high above the surrounding sanctuary. Even today, only a fraction of the original columns remain standing. The staircase leading toward the temple is also enormous. Visitors would have climbed a monumental flight of steps, passing between massive columns, before reaching the interior of the sanctuary. The architecture was designed to overwhelm. It was not meant to feel like an ordinary building. But then, something even more unusual appears inside. The central sacred space was not covered by a normal roof. Instead, the heart of the temple remained open to the sky. Deep inside this enormous courtyard, a smaller temple stood over the sacred spring. This smaller structure was known as a naiscos. The sacred spring was extremely important. Water had been connected with the sanctuary since its earliest history. Its presence inside the monumental temple created a direct connection between the ancient sacred landscape, the oracle, and the new architecture. The temple was enormous, but at its center, the ancient spring remained. The builders also created a long internal staircase. It led down from the upper parts of the temple toward the lower sacred spaces. The passageways were carefully incorporated into the architecture, creating a dramatic transition between the bright exterior and the darker interior. Some of the stonework is extraordinary. Massive marble blocks were fitted together. Columns were carefully shaped, and elaborate decorative elements were carved into the temple. Even unfinished sections reveal the complexity of the construction. Some surfaces still show marks left by ancient workers. The temple was never completed. Construction continued for centuries, but the project was enormous, and maintaining such a massive building program required enormous resources. Political changes, economic pressures, and changes in the ancient world eventually brought construction to an end. The temple remained unfinished. This creates one of the most fascinating sights at Didyma. Some parts look almost complete, while other areas reveal the stages of construction. You can see huge columns standing without their final finishing, blocks that were prepared but never fully carved, and architectural elements that were abandoned where they stood. Imagine the sanctuary during its greatest period. Pilgrims arriving along the sacred road, priests moving through the temple, offerings being brought to Apollo, and visitors climbing the enormous staircase. At the center, the sacred spring remained inside the open courtyard. The entire complex would have been filled with movement. The sanctuary also attracted powerful visitors. Ancient traditions connect Didyma with rulers and wealthy individuals who offered gifts to Apollo. Among those associated with offerings at the sanctuary were the Egyptian king Necho II and the Lydian king Croesus. The fame of the oracle had spread far beyond the local region. But Didyma's history did not end with the Greeks. The Romans continued to use the sanctuary, and the temple remained an important religious site. The surrounding world changed, but the enormous temple continued to dominate the landscape. Eventually, the ancient religious system began to disappear. Christianity transformed the religious landscape. The old sanctuary lost its original function, and the temple was gradually abandoned. Some of its stones were reused, others collapsed, and the unfinished monument slowly became a ruin. For centuries, the enormous remains stood exposed to the elements. Columns fell, walls cracked, and vegetation spread through the ancient sanctuary. But because so much of the structure was never completely dismantled, large portions remained visible. Modern archaeological excavations began uncovering the sanctuary in much greater detail. Researchers discovered earlier architectural phases, ancient inscriptions, sculptures, fragments of columns, and evidence of the sacred spring. The site slowly revealed that the enormous ruins belonged to a much older religious tradition. Today, the Temple of Apollo at Didyma remains one of the most impressive ancient structures in Turkey. Some of its columns still rise high above the ruins, while enormous blocks lie scattered across the sanctuary. The unfinished surfaces are almost as interesting as the completed carvings. They show how ancient craftsmen actually worked.